So welcome everyone to this webinar. I'm Sughosh and I'm a member of the Marie Curie Alumni Association. And more specifically, I work for the MCAA Communication Working Group. Before I introduce Jason, one or two lines about what the MCAA is. So the Marie Curie Alumni Association is an international nonprofit established and supported by the European Commission, but entirely run by volunteers like us. The MCA is a major platform for researchers to contribute to shaping science policy in Europe, providing career development opportunities and supporting the wider research community on topics affecting researchers and research and researchers' life. The MCA Communication Working Group in particular handles the communication strategy of the MCAA, be it through social media, newsletters, magazines, and outreach activities. The goal is to provide innovative, high quality, consistent communications, be it online or in print. With that, I think I'll just introduce Jason. So Jason Palmer, many of you may already be aware as the host of the Intelligence podcast. He did his PhD in molecular physics from Imperial College London. Followed by a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellowship at the European Laboratory for Nonlinear Spectroscopy in Florence. And before that, he held undergraduate degrees in physics and mathematics from the University of Florida. Career highlights, there are quite a few, but to just keep it short, he worked as a science and technology reporter at BBC News. He was also a Knight Science Journalism Fellow at MIT. We'll be talking more about that. And since 2014, he has been at the Economist, and within this organization, he has held various roles as a science and technology correspondent, co-editor of the Economist Espresso, which is an app, and also currently as the host of the Intelligence podcast. With this, welcome, Jason. So yeah, I mean, the overall webinar would be a conversation, so you can keep your questions coming through the chat. We'll take them during the conversation or at the end. So yeah, to begin with, just Jason, if you could share this, tell us about what your growing up years were like, and how did you come across, and when did you decide to get into research, and yeah, what were your growing up years like during your graduate and undergraduate?
Wow. Okay. A biography in full. Let's not go back as far as early years. I don't know how instructive it is. I should say, though, that in a general sense, my life path, career path, couldn't be called linear. I initially went to university with the intent of becoming an architect. But the American university education system, liberal arts education system, has something that I'm a big fan of now in retrospect, called general education, where no matter what you were studying, you have to take a few courses in this and a few courses in that, whether you're going to be a lawyer or a ballerina or whatever, you take, some physical science and a foreign language and a performing art and what have you. And I was pretty much the only person in my introductory physics courses to really, really love physics. And so I changed my major to physics, and then back and forth between physics and astronomy for a while, and eventually settled on physics. And I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do with it. I just knew that I really liked the subject. Everybody around me at the time in the department told me that you'll never get a good job with just an undergraduate degree in physics. And so I had it in the back of my mind that probably I was going to need to go back to graduate school, but I wanted to see if I could prove them wrong. And after doing a little summer placement of the sort you do as an undergraduate at Lawrence Livermore Lab, one of their research scientists called and said he was just kind of looking for a junior, a warm body essentially to come and work on some high power laser stuff, which at the time sounded amazing. And so I packed up my life right after undergrad and went and ended up essentially being sort of almost falling into a staff job there, building and using high power lasers for a largely sort of industrial kind of related thing. Sorry, I'm skipping through all the details here. While I was there, one of my supervisors was a postdoc from Imperial College, and he was all the while he was there applying for grants and got a really big one, a joint infrastructure fund grant of a few £1 million to build a lab from absolute scratch, doing stuff in vibrational spectroscopy. And he said, you know, we've got the money, but we don't have the people. How would you like to come be my PhD student in London? That was then enough to make me think, well, maybe this whole graduate school thing is probably a good deal. And I came over for that. And so that's pretty much how I ended up in the particular pursuit I ended up in, non-linearly.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, Lawrence Livermore to Imperial College London, and then what was the experience at Imperial College London like? And you also did a postdoc after that.
Yeah, so how I get to the the career path that I'm on now kind of happened at Imperial, in the sense that I ended up towards the end of my PhD, like almost every PhD student in the history of the world, a fairly downtrodden, disillusioned individual. And I was also thinking about what the research world path looked like. I wasn't hugely interested in teaching. Didn't seem like that would give me a great deal of joy. I was really very interested in keeping busy with my hands, being busy in the lab, making things happen in the lab. But without, I basically didn't want to climb the ladder as it seemed would be necessary at the time. So I started to think about the things that I might do instead, using the skills that I had. I mean, I had some pretty outlandish thoughts as well about going off and, being a deckhand on a yacht or whatever, but more seriously, science communication in general was one of the things that came up. That being science journalism or science writing in a more general sense, or being perhaps working at a science museum and doing outreach activities there, all that kind of stuff, and just kind of started looking into that. And it was the writing that appealed to me because I kind of always liked writing a bit. And I started asking around, and someone put me in touch with John Emsley, who's a science writer in residence, many book writer at Oxford University. And I sent him a note, basically telling him my tale, saying how somebody said I should get in touch. And really nice guy, who I've still not met in person, writes back this giant email saying, basically kind of giving me a little bit of sage advice, very realistic advice, that it's a hard job to get into, that you'll have a lot of failures for every success. Importantly, that it's not for everybody, and do listen to the signals if it doesn't seem like it's for you. But most importantly, he said, get a job to keep the wolves from the door, to kind of keep some money coming in case it doesn't work out. And so I sort of resolved then to take a postdoc to sort of carry on in the research path, safe in the knowledge that I was going to spend all of my evenings and weekends and holidays, doing some writing on the side to see how it went. So essentially, I was kind of taking on two jobs when I took on the postdoc, because I knew I was going to be trying to break into this new gig.
Okay. So yeah, before moving on, there's an interesting question coming up from Namrata. So she says, I really love this nonlinear part. The most common narrative with scientists seems to be knowing as a child that science and research is people's calling. How well has the spontaneity, non-linearity continued to serve you in your career?
Oh, great. I mean, I've been, exceedingly lucky, but there is a certain amount of, to my mind, amount of making your own luck, and seizing opportunities and doing the scary or the uncertain thing. And again, I know that I've been very lucky, but I think that's really served me well. I know it would be a cleaner narrative if I said, I always wanted to be a journalist, and this is, exactly, what I always wanted to be. But if so, I took such the long way around. I spent so much time and money to get to this point. I've just sort of followed my interests where they have led, and they've led me to some fun places.
Yeah, I mean, that's a connecting question. Like, what were the initial challenges like when you just make the first transition, when you enter an area where you find more journalists, and you are maybe isolated, kind of having this lot of degrees with PhDs and postdoc, and then you are suddenly have to start again from square one. So what were the initial days like? It was just before BBC, or
so there's a few steps in the middle there. I mean, there's two questions there, really. One is, what was the culture change like, and then what was it like to start over? The culture change, or the the realization that I wasn't going to be as instantly good at this as I thought I was, it had everything to do with not knowing how the business worked. I didn't know how science news was made and how, the newsy halves of journals or news organizations actually worked. And I also thought that knowing how to write a paper, knowing how to write a grant proposal, knowing how to write a letter would be any help with that. There is an art form, there is an expertise to it, and I was utterly awful at it at the beginning. And helpfully, I ran across some people who wanted to help me get better, and I did spend all of those nights and evenings and weekends and holidays and what have you when I was in Florence, trying to get better at it. In terms of the starting over, I mean, that's always hard, not least because it's not the most lucrative business in the world. And at the very beginning of it, when you're just doing sort of freelance things for, 100 here and a couple of hundred there and so on, it's not a life, in and of itself. But it's also, a little bit hard to be the new kid, after developing some expertise. But in the end, I mean, there's nothing more to say than you just have to sort of swallow that if that's, the path you want to go down.
But yeah, so that's a negative part, but just for some ego boost for everybody who's attending this. So what were the positives that you could translate from your PhD and postdoc, like any transferable skills from your PhD and postdoc?
There again, I see sort of two questions. What did I bring to the table that turned out to be helpful, and what was the good side of it all? The good side of it is it was absolutely thrilling, right? I saw this business that I admired the people who did it. I could tell the good stuff from the bad stuff, and suddenly I was actually getting published in magazines I knew and websites that I read, and saw my name in lights, and I just thought it was the coolest thing in the world. And so in that sense, it was almost immediately sufficiently gratifying to be worth all of the graft. As far as the skills, I mean, if you were restricted to science journalism, there is, I mean, probably the single greatest skill that you get when you're, a research scientist or a PhD student is, there is an unconquerable amount of information, of papers and conference proceedings out there to get through to answer the kind of question that you're answering. Whatever your question is, you really have to dig through lots of material. And in the best case, you're digging through things that are kind of peripheral to and finding the ideas that translate, or the things that help build an argument, or that point to an experiment, or whatever it is. And I think it's no different really when you're trying to write a news story, to find out why this new thing that's just about to come out in a Nature paper, say, is important, is influential, is maybe not what everybody thinks. And so being able to just pick up a big paper, a big 75-page review paper, and skim through it and know in 10 minutes whether that's going to help you or not, and put it aside or dig deeper, that kind of just really knowing how to trawl the literature and knowing where to look, and crucially kind of knowing how to get through the unhelpful stuff and to the helpful stuff. I think that, I mean, that's a life skill, I suppose, in general, for anybody who works with words, with trenches of information, is the sifting. And I think PhD and the research life really taught me how to do that part well.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, before moving to The Economist, we just spend some time on how did you get your first job at BBC, because that's like a dream job. You want to work in journalism, and you're getting BBC as your first.
Yeah, I couldn't believe it myself. So it started with a couple of internships. While I was still in Florence, I applied for a couple of science journalism internships. There were a few that were based in London. I knew when I wanted to come back to London. And I got one actually at The Economist first. And that was 3 months, and then one for 6 months at New Scientist. And while I was, when that sort of ran out, they let you do what's called freelancing on the desk, where basically you don't have a staff job, but you can continue to use the phone and a desk, and you get freelance rates for what you make. It's a a co-working space, essentially. And while I was there, somebody I was working with, her partner had applied for a certain fellowship based in Boston. He was going to be leaving the BBC, and she said, they don't really know what they're going to do to replace him yet, so you might want to drop them a line, while you're just here freelancing. Maybe you could go freelance for them. So I dropped them a line, and I had a little interview with them, and they said, okay, well, we don't know what we're going to do. Could you come and just freelance on the desk for us for 4 weeks? So I said, sure, great, sounds fascinating. As you say, BBC, this is the Mecca. And essentially I just never left. The 4 weeks came up. They were not very good at figuring out what they were going to do. I tried very hard to convince them that maybe they wanted to replace him with me, and never said no to anything. Was completely open to trying and doing anything new, and being frankly out of my depth. Right, all I have done at this point is whatever it is, 9 months worth of internships and so on. I haven't at that stage been really trained, but I was surrounded by extremely talented people who helped me along and let me make some small mistakes and stop me from making some big mistakes. And essentially over the longer run, I took over his role, half on the technology desk and half on the science desk. And then I got a training that I didn't expect, which we can get into if you want, but essentially I got a sort of an accidental master's in journalism while I was there.
Oh, okay, yeah. So, I mean, that was the next question. So, from here, you moved on to one of the most prestigious journalism fellowships, right? At the MIT, the Knight Science Journalism Fellowship. I was checking the website. They take only 10 candidates every year, and it's an extremely competitive process. So, yeah, what was your experience at MIT? Going back to school, but I saw their curriculum. It's not like a regular course. It's a combination of seminars, project work. So yeah, how was your experience at MIT with this fellowship?
Absolutely one of the best things that I ever did. It's exactly, in fact, the fellowship that the guy from the BBC was going to go do. So that's how I first came to know about it, right? I mean, I might just be following around in his footsteps. But yeah, it's, as you say, it's not very structured. It's not a course per se. It's supposed to be for mid-career journalists. I think I was probably a little bit early in journalism to be called mid-career, but also I was kind of getting on in years. So, but it was first and foremost the open season, carte blanche to take whatever course you wanted at MIT or at Harvard. And then they also laid on a great many seminars. They would bring in people to talk about their research from either of those and surrounding institutions on important and maybe consequential and controversial aspects of science, just basically bringing in the experts to us. And so it was just a sort of, it was just a, I don't know how to put it. It was structured a bit in that there were some things that we were kind of expected to do and that, we very much wanted to do every week, but the rest of it was kind of open. And some people had come to write a book. And so they had just exactly one thing they wanted to focus on, or one group they wanted to sort of embed with, or whatever it was. And then some people like me, again, being that kind of intellectual magpie, I just did a little bit of everything. I took a history of news course at Harvard. I spent some time in the glass blowing lab at MIT, like just a real mix and mess of things, and also got the chance to learn from the other fellows, because it's a very international program. It's half from America and half international, and they try to make a real mix of things: newspaper writers, wire agency writers, filmmakers, what have you. And so it was a real, because we were all part of this same kind of strange experience, became really quite tight knit, and learned a lot from each other about how you do the science journalism in different media, in different countries, in different regions. It was just if it was possible to still be there doing that, I'd still be there doing that.
So yeah, I'll just there's one more question coming up. Is like, can you talk about tools? You did touch upon these things, but maybe can you talk about tools that help you cope with being out of your depth? Feels like they throw everything at you in early days as a science journalist. Did you ever suffer from imposter syndrome in that context?
I have never not had imposter syndrome. To a degree, I have imposter syndrome right now. And look, everybody gets it, and there's very little that you can do, to make that feeling go away. But there's plenty of things that you can do to kind of like cope with it, I suppose. And the number one thing, and I think probably a scientific education might contribute to this too, is to be forthright with yourself that you don't know stuff. Don't just, when someone says, "Oh, well, you know this, right?" If you don't say no, it's so tempting just to say, "Oh yeah, no, I know that." To be willing to call up, maybe Nobel level scientists and ask what you kind of know to be stupid questions. You'll be surprised at how many subtle answers come out of that kind of thing. It's really just sort of throwing your hands up at the outset and saying, I don't know, and that's okay, I think has dealt with that a lot. But at the same time, I've ended up, again, I hung up my lab coat on a Friday and I was at The Economist writing about science on a Monday. How was I not going to have imposter syndrome? 9 months later, I'm inside the doors of the BBC and all of the big broadcast operation around me. And, within a few months, would you like to do a radio piece? Maybe. Yeah, I've been chased by the imposter syndrome for all of this time. I guess maybe barely keeping ahead of it.
So yeah, moving on to the next question. Yeah, so working, from there, I think after the night science journalism, you then joined the Economist after that. So yeah, the Economist, here you have a front row seat to latest developments happening around the world. So this is a typical question. What's a day at the Economist like?
Well, as you pointed out, I've had sort of a few roles there. I don't know how much detail you want to go into, but of course, the day that you have depends on kind of which part of the machine that you're in. We've got a digital, like every legacy print operation in the world, we have a sort of a growing digital operation, which in a lot of ways, and a lot of these institutions is still kind of growing and finding the culture where they mix. So what that means is that there is no typical day really. When it was, I think, to go back to when I was actually a science writer there, for the benefit of those who want to know what that was like, you probably kind of have to go back to the print cycle, right? So they put out, like so many do, a magazine once a week, and so the natural rhythm of things is written around that 1 week thing. So Monday is a big editorial all hand meeting on what's going to be in print, these days also in digital. Monday and Tuesday, you get commissioned to write your story on the Monday. It will be due, let's call it Wednesday at noon, say. So really, it's quite compressed. You've only got about a half of the week to do your writing. Usually by the time you've pitched it, you've done some of the research already. This is not like coming out of nowhere unless it's a kind of breaking news story. The rest of Monday and Tuesday is furiously bashing the phone and sending emails and, reading through things and just trying to get through it. It's a very front-loaded week. And then you file your copy by Wednesday. It gets edited by the editor, can go back and forth once, twice, 3 times, what have you, with the editor. And we actually usually went to press on Wednesday evenings. And so then, which is to say that part of the actual magazine went off to the printers on Wednesday evening. So that week's, edition was then set. And then Thursday and Friday, inevitably long, tedious meetings and what have you, but also kind of more thinking time. So it's not just about what's going to go into this week's, but like maybe you have a pet project. You want to do a longer piece, a briefing or an essay or a special report, the really big ones that are often on the covers. And so, it's a lot more sort of free form, or you're just working your contacts, asking around. You remember perhaps that you wrote a story about this fusion experiment a few months ago, and they said things should be kind of ramping up by now. And you go, oh, I should probably call her and find out how that's been going. Just kind of keeping it all ticking over, kind of thing. Now, I moved on from then to from that role to Espresso, which was our first kind of daily news product per se, right? We're trying to get something specifically out every day, 5 stories of 150 words. And when I started, it was it was run like an internal startup, almost extremely underfunded, run entirely independently of the rest of the news operation. And I took on a role that I'm still fulfilling, which is going around to people who are already busy saying, hey, I need you to do this extra thing. Can you give me this extra thing? Basically getting our writers to do a sort of 150-word thing. The stories were chosen each day because they were going to be a thing that happened that day, right? So I might go to the a business correspondent and say that Boeing is reporting results tomorrow. Can we have 150 words on what's going on at Boeing? Say, always sort of built around this idea of the peg is coming, this event is coming, here's what we should expect. That was the kind of the value proposition of the app. But it was me and one other guy, and we're doing 5 stories a day with pictures, often with charts, with fact checking. It was really intense. And so every day was the same in the sense that every day was just sort of a scramble to get all of that content together, prettified, to the style guide, to get a libel check, to do kind of all of the, it's 99% as much work to do a sort of 150-word story as it is to do a 1,000-word story, right? All the steps are still there. And so those days were frenetic, frankly. And then, of course, once moving to the podcast world, it's an entirely different day again.
even within the Economist, I mean, you began as a science writer and a science journalist, but we're talking about imposter syndrome and changing career paths. But even within Economist, you moved from science journalism to something that covers everything, because the Intelligence podcast covers the latest development and picks up top 3 stories that will be of interest to the viewer. Even today's podcast is about right from economy and the protest in Iran and the footballers. So the spectrum, there's no, because it would have been logical that if you are associated with the podcast, The Babbage at The Economist, which is a science and technology podcast, but this is the intelligence. So if you could tell us about that, expanding that, and what are the things that you had to learn? Because now it's like you have to know about something about everything. This is no longer sticking to science, but moving to news entirely.
Yes, that was hard. That is hard. I think the time that I spent doing Espresso really helped with that, though, because that first step from just science to a little bit of everything. Again, there was not a lot of oversight, not a lot of integration with the existing system. I just knew that we had to get in sort of a mix of stories. It should be a mix of so a little bit of business, a little bit of finance, what have you. And I would get this copy in from these people who were clearly experts in their field. And I got to tell you, I was spending a lot of time on, online encyclopedias of finance and the like to try to understand all of these little things. So imposter syndrome was perhaps at its absolute peak at this stage, because I've kind of made a name doing science journalism for, something like 10 years by this point. Suddenly trusted by the bosses to, yeah, well, I'm sure he'll be good at that too, which is something The Economist does quite a lot. I think they just, I don't know, they just let people sink or swim, basically, and everybody around me is swimming. But I did spend a lot of time just learning the basics about a lot of things. And I think I had let myself get a little bit intellectually lazy. I think doing the science stuff, I didn't pay attention to the Israeli-Palestine conflict, right? Or business in Southeast Asia or what have you. I don't need to know that stuff because I'm your science guy. It's cool. And then I came to realize that I really had quite a lot to learn. So in the Espresso job, I found myself doing that little bit of learning, enough to sort of get through a story and make sure that it's factually correct and sensibly laid out and what have you. But really, I was relying on good copy coming in. But that gave me the chance, the obligation, in fact, to learn a little bit about everything. And the joke that I have made since then and still to this day is that I know 6 facts about absolutely everything, but not 7. A sort of cocktail party level of knowledge about really quite a lot of things. But that did set me up really well for the intelligence, where I was kind of doing the same sort of thing. First of all, can you give me a thing? Can you come talk to me on this show, right? Another thing I'm still begging for, but also at least a little bit of backing, right? So when that Israeli-Palestine story comes up, or the business in Southeast Asia story comes up, I have just a little bit of, background that's now quite 5-6 years old now, of like, but I can say things like, oh, but I remember back in, and I sound like somebody who kind of knows what they're talking about, but really, that's relatively new knowledge. It's relatively shallow knowledge. And the most important thing of all is, I'm not the guy who's supposed to know. I'm just supposed to ask the smart questions, right? I'm just eliciting the expertise from the real experts. If I happen to know some stuff, then all the better in kind of like guiding the conversation. But helpfully for us all, I don't have to know it all.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, now I was also seeing your previous interviews once with the King's Business Club, and they had asked a very important question. They had this very interesting question, like, news in a way affects everybody. Just watching news affects everybody depending upon the news, and you are even one step closer to the news. So what are the pressures and what are the challenges? Do you get affected by it? The happenings of, because every day something or the other, good or bad, is happening around the world. So how do you ensure that you keep a distance between the news and you? How do you not let it affect you? Yeah.
I mean, it's always going to affect you to some degree. You say that every day something good, something bad's happening around the world. Well, I don't know. The news business is very good at only showing you the bad. Except for the last couple of minutes of television news broadcasts. There's always something goofy and fun at the end of those. Look, it necessarily is going to affect you, if not in an acute way because of a particularly affecting story, then in some sort of, chronic, cumulative way when, when you have to keep coming back to a really grim story, right? And we have lots of those. I don't have any coping strategies per se. I have in the past got really quite worked up about stories that we've had to keep coming back to about, the horrors in Xinjiang, for example. It does eventually kind of grind on you, right? But there is the need to sort of be even-handed when reporting it and so on. But yeah, it can be quite troubling, and especially in that cumulative rather than acute sense, and that sort of creeping sense that I think you'd get even if you were just a news consumer, that, man, it's all screwed out there. Everything's just going to pot. But I think if there is a coping strategy, it is to kind of compartmentalize, I suppose, my news obsession to the working day and try not to obsess about it aside from that, not to spend too much time on Twitter, not to really go deep on stories that where I feel particularly helpless, right? It's a sort of limiting the exposure in as much as I can, but leaving the space then to be able to do it sort of professionally. This is all a long way of dancing around the answer that, like, how do I avoid that? I kind of don't, because you can't, but the news moves on. An unhappy answer, I realize.
Yeah. So I think this is more of a general question. Like, most of the participants here are either in the PhD or doing their postdoc. And if anybody wants to make a shift to journalism or science writing, so what would be your sage advice to them would be at this juncture? So some are maybe PhD students, some are a postdoc.
Well, I think I would pass on the same advice that I received from John Emsley, which is, have a try at it in a sort of low stakes kind of way first, and see how it suits you, right? There's lots of places, campus newspapers or trade journals that are related to the particular thing that you're in. I remember one of the first places I ever got published was in Materials Today, which probably nobody's heard of. It's an Elsevier kind of trade mag. Most of the words that are in there are just to pad out advertisements. There are a lot of trade magazines like that. They're really just looking for, actual, real experts in this stuff, because the magazines are for experts. That kind of thing, right? Where you don't aim to get something placed in Nature or Science or on the BBC on your first go, right? You get some clips. All of this to say, keep a day job, and start small and be humble about it. And in particular, if you're coming from the research world, don't make the mistake that I did, that, just because you read stuff that you know to be crap science journalism, that you could at the outset do any better. Like, it is a skill. There are some principles, but there's also some art to it, and be humble about acquiring all of that.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, let's just check. So any questions in the chat? So Nicoletta?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, any more questions from that? So I think I have exhausted my list of questions.
Sorry, I should have expanded more generously.
No. So there's yeah, you can go ahead.
Let's first ask the question from Ruben, and then I'll go with mine.
Okay, so Ruben is asking, especially in news, as you mentioned, deadlines are very tight. What about writer's block? How many times, if any, did it happen, and how did you overcome
it? Okay, so the blank page is the most daunting thing in all of writing, and I think probably everybody knows that, whether it's a grant proposal or a love letter, right? The way I've come to get past it, the time that it comes the most is when I've done the most work rather than the least, right? When I just have absolutely piles of material. I've spoken to dozens of people, and I've got all of these papers piled up and so on. And the way that I get past it, not the artistic block, but the sort of mechanistic block, is just to break things down into, what are the absolute core ideas that I have to get across. You can't start at the top of the blank page and say, here's how I want to start. Sometimes that makes itself apparent, sometimes not. But I think in a general sense, whether you're writing a 9,000 word special report, or even if you're writing a Facebook post, right? What is the core idea, or what are the few core ideas that I want to get across, right? Bunch of carriage return, bunch of returns, get to the center of that empty page and just start writing ideas about that, right? Pulling out quotes that you like, fleshing these things out and so on. Very often a sort of a narrative will often emerge out of that. And I think that probably the biggest writer's block comes from the conviction that you should have in your head, this is the whole thing, I just need to start writing it, right? It doesn't, for me anyway, happen that way.
Yeah, just to add on to that, what's your process like? Do you generally write in one go, or is it okay, if there's a deadline, then you have to write it in one go? But for an article, because I know you also write for the 1843 magazine on cocktails, and so for articles which you write, okay, maybe they are not hard deadlines. How do you go about it? You do it in one sitting, or you just spread it out over the
No,
week?
it's always in a lot of sittings. I always find sleeping on things is good. So, if the deadline is at least one evening away, then I make sure that some of the work gets done the next day. And one of the most widespread dictums in this business that couldn't be more true is writing is rewriting. So if you sit down and do it all in one and then submit it, I think you've done it the wrong way. I find that it's on the sort of second pass or the third pass that I realized that, actually, this would be much more convincing an argument if you turned it around this way, or, oh, I forgot when I first went through this to put in, this contribution from this person or whatever. So I don't think anybody, I mean, there are some superhuman writers out there, I suppose. I shouldn't say no one does it, but very few people just sit down and bash it out, because that presumes then that you have that whole structure, in your mind. I don't think a lot of people work that way. And also, I don't think that that sort of one sitting kind of thing lends itself, even if you kind of don't start at the beginning, but you just kind of just vomit it all out on the page. You've actually got all of your ideas there. There's lots of things sort of knocking around. And again, with a bit of distance, a bit of time, a bit of sleep, you can kind of, things for me anyway, coalesce better.
Okay, so there's one more question from Namrata. She's, can you talk about your process for spotting stories that are worth pursuing?
Yeah.
Maybe the journalistic sense, like.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's actually a question about how the science news gets made, right? As probably most people on this call know, it's kind of overwhelmingly from peer-reviewed research papers, right? There's a few stories that are kind of proper breaking news, and a few things that, whatever, when a new fossil is discovered, or when some spacecraft gets to some planet, and that's not necessarily a paper immediately, right? But for the most part, it's down to what's in the research literature. What happens if you kind of get established as a science journalist is you get kind of early access to some things. So your really big journals, PNAS and Nature and Science and Cell and what have you, you get on what are called tip sheets, and you kind of know in advance, ahead of the embargoes, kind of what's coming. And of course, plenty of people are very good at digging through preprint servers. When I started, there was really only archive. Now there's a bunch of them, and there's a real sort of culture of it. And so it's a matter of, or things like Scopus, and the real big libraries of papers and so on. And it's basically a fairly mechanistic business of cranking through all of those things, just looking through all of them, and getting a short list of, oh, that seems interesting. At the outset, that's really hard because you don't know what's interesting. Like when I first started, all I really knew was laser stuff. And I didn't know how to tell what an interesting paper in material science, say, was, or certainly anything in medicine. And so that, to a degree, comes with, or rather, it's easier to do when you've got the experience. I've looked at a story like this before. The thing they were waiting to figure out was this, or what's holding up that field is this, or what would be really interesting is if they find that, what have you. You start to know those things. In the beginning, each one's its own little research project, right? That sounds interesting. I think the key thing there is trust your instincts. That seems interesting. Hang on. And then you dig into it, and then you find out, like, what is holding this up? What does this new paper bring? Is this another one of those roll-up TV screens or slightly better batteries that's a really boring story that they've tried to make sound interesting and so on? Like there's a lot of, there's some really genuinely thrilling things out there, and then there's some real tropes, some real sort of things that just keep showing up and people fall for them because the narrative around them is it's going to revolutionize the world. You learn to spot those too. So the process for finding, is slightly changes from having no experience to having lots of it, where you can just sort of skim through those things at the end and go and just really kind of pluck them out with great fidelity. But in the end, it's about kind of knowing what's out there, knowing what's missing in various fields, and to no small degree, knowing which editors like which kind of stuff, right? I got to a point when I was freelancing that I could spot a story that would be brilliant for New Scientist, but I knew The Economist wouldn't want, for example.
So yeah, just an additional question. I mean, you moved on from science writing to, a general, more from a specific, the specialist to a generalist position. But do you still keep an eye on the science stories? And because I saw a YouTube video of yours where you're talking about demystifying quantum computing or something like that. So are there any fields, areas in science that you always keep an eye on that, okay, something interesting may or may not come up, but just for your, just for to satisfy your previous avatar?
Yeah, a bit, though it's more general than specific. So I still read a lot of newsletters and occasionally pick up and read the front half of Nature or something like that. It's a much more generalist approach. The quantum thing is a little bit of a weird one. It was one of the last things, as I was moving on to Espresso, I wrote a special report about quantum technology in general that also includes quantum computing. And I had chosen to do that because when I was at the BBC, there was not really any other sort of hardcore physicsy people around who were chasing that kind of stuff. And I'll tell you the truth. There was, there's a certain amount of clickability of stories with the word quantum in it, and I just thought it was really cool stuff. And there is real potential there. And so I ended up in this role at the BBC, where I was kind of both bigging up and debunking a lot of quantum stories, telling the stories when things were moving ahead in meaningful ways, and also writing those like, what is a quantum computer, and like, why should I care kind of stories and so on, not just the unabashed hype. So I kind of brought that with me to The Economist, and then things kind of moved ahead. There's real business interest there's real investment there's real venture capital involved in many of these technologies now, which kind of brings it more into Economist territory. Like, how does it actually affect the world, and and the movement of money and jobs? And so I kind of pitched it to them and ended up doing like the biggest deep dive of my whole life to do this big 9,000 word thing. Ended up on the cover, all very wonderful and everything. But like that kind of sort of, whether I wanted it to or not, sort of cemented me in the world of like, oh yeah, you're that guy who knows about the quantum stuff, right? So I still talk to a lot of people about that, and get invited to write things or talk to conferences about that sort of thing, because at least then, I'm not so sure now, to be honest, but at least then I was pretty up on everything that was going on. That's probably the only topic that I'm specifically kind of still keeping an eye on because I feel so invested in it. But yeah, in a general sense, like I would never leave my first love of science behind.
Nicoletta, I'll take the question.
Yeah, I can be the next one.
Yeah.
My curiosity is around, like you mentioned that you read several newsletters, and would you like to share with us and maybe recommend us what newspapers, newsletters, podcasts we should listen to, read to, and kind of pay attention?
Well, first of all, anything I might suggest in the sciences, I don't think would surprise any of you, but I'm a little wary of giving recommendations because they're attuned to my interests. And there's just so much stuff out there. What I would recommend much more is experimentation. There's no magic bullet, right? And as everybody will know, there are a tremendous number of really low value podcasts out there, right? It depends on how you want to attack these things, right? I quite like pop science stuff, right? As much as I like the really, hardcore stuff. I've ended up being fallen in with lots of these sort of innovation related podcasts, again, of which there are many crap ones, just because I'm interested in essentially how ideas become technologies, become businesses, what have you, in a way that I wasn't interested years ago. So I'm basically entirely dodging the question and saying, I think you should like continue to seek these things out. Don't get stuck in a rut. Do take recommendations, give it a listen. If you're not absolutely grabbed in 15 minutes, then give up, because there's too much out there to listen to things you're not sure about. Just play, experiment, be the intellectual magpie.
Thank you. I do have one more question, which is a bit, it's related more like working with journalists.
Oh, it's awful. Yeah, I wouldn't recommend it.
And how to build relationships, and like, do you have some meetups between you journalists and kind of keeping informed each of like each one, or how it is to work with journalists? Because we know how it is between us scientists and how we talk and so on, but then on the journalist side.
Yeah, I think there was a more I think there is a at least in Britain, there is a fairly tight-knit group of science journalists and organizations that that sort of, you know, sponsor parties and have get-togethers and have annual parties in the summer or at Christmas time or whatever it is. And so there really is a kind of, you know, no matter where it is that you work, you'll end up in the same room with these people. Also, when you go to, you know, press conferences, and there's an organization here called the Science Media Center, which puts on press conferences when big papers come out in a bid to kind of like get experts in the room and not have, you know, newspaper reporters who might not know that topic very well, just kind of guessing and Googling. They'll just like convene, like, we know this big paper is coming. Those are all the same people that you'll see at the, you know, at the Christmas party and so on. So within the science community, I think there's a lot of room for, there's a lot of space, again, in Britain anyway, for getting together in a social capacity. Journalists, in a general sense, I have found, are very social beasts, often known to have a drink, which often loosens up interpersonal communications. In the most general sense, I don't know if there's a kind of a general like club of journalists that routinely gets together. There's a frontline club, but that's really mostly for your hardened foreign correspondent types. There's not a sort of general journalists club, as it were, that's informal or formal. But what I have found in the more general sense is people do like hanging out. There's not a lot of, it's not an insular business. It's a very social business. It's a business that's based on people having chats with strangers, right? So it's no different if your stranger is your source or that person who works at the Telegraph you haven't met yet or whatever. So there's plenty of opportunity in the science, less so in the general, but, you know, you run into each other at some other party and what have you, then you'll get on just the same.
Thank you.
What we need is more conferences, like scientists have conferences. There are a few of those, but not very well attended.
So yeah, one more question Ruben has asked in the chat. I'll go ahead with that. So Ruben says, I work in medical communications and sometimes we also have to write a variety of pieces. Clearly within the company I work for, there are editors who copy it and make sure the story flow is nice and the English is absolutely perfect. However, sometimes personal styles don't really match. How do you handle that? Any funny anecdote about it?
We're talking about the match, whether or not one's personal writing style can or should get through. Is that the question?
Yeah. So in a way that, but also I know that the Economist has certain guidelines. It also publishes a book like how it should be. Yeah, so how do you deal with if you have articles written by a different writer? The English and all is right, but the personal style maybe doesn't match the style that you want or the Economist wants. So how do you deal with that? Yeah.
Okay, I would say that the Economist is sort of is anomalous in this. So let me caveat this with, this is probably an extreme case, but I had come to know writing in the Economist style as speaking economies. We have a style guide. It's about that thick, and it has a very distinctive voice. So when I did my internship all those years ago, I would file my copy and, you know, stuff that would have worked for previous editors and what have you, and then I would get it back from the science editor and it would have been completely eviscerated, completely changed, because that voice is so tightly controlled, so distinctive. So in that sense, kind of whatever it is that you get in, now that I speak economies, right, I think the analogy is quite strong in terms of you just do a translation. I just need to translate this into economies, and got very used to doing that. Certainly during the first stint when I was a science correspondent, I was getting in a lot of freelance copy. I was the online science editor, and there was also the print science editor. And, you know, I got better at speaking economies then. to answer a more general question, and I'm not sure this is the question that was posed, but it's probably a worthwhile one, is about speaking to the audience that you've got, right? If you find yourself in a role where you're writing for, obviously you're going to use a different voice, if you like, or a different sort of mode of attack if you're writing a grant proposal as from writing a newspaper story, right? But in the science communication world more at large, you might be writing for like only subtly different audiences, right? And I would just say that like one of the most useful tools in the toolbox is to kind of almost imagine a canonical reader, the audience member. It can be like one person, like I'm just going to speak to her, if you like. I know I've been told, in fact, to think this way, I think, along the way. And just to be very careful about, you know, to make sure you're talking to the right person. You might have views that are relevant to a different audience, right? Or you might talk to a different audience in a different way. And if you have a role, or you have a number of different editors that you're serving, if you're a freelancer, that in turn have their own different audiences and so on, so you can have a very strong idea of who's there listening, reading, watching, and to kind of focus your voice on them. The thing is about economies is, you know, that's very narrowly focused, and whatever copy I get in or whatever copy I write myself and so on is going to get translated into economies regardless, because there is the imagined writer, imagined reader or listener in case of the podcast. It's probably actually a bad habit I've got by now. I can almost only speak economies. I'd write a love letter in economies.
So yeah, now there's one more question, but it's a very broad question. I'll just read out the question to you. How do you manage to keep your objectivity as a journalist beyond personal opinion, preferences, contacts, bias, politics, etc.? But that's too broad, but yeah.
Well, this is PhD level journalism philosophy stuff, right? How do I keep it out? A conviction that it probably needs to stay out is enough for me. I like my job, but I like to keep it. With places like the, they're philosophically, there couldn't be a bigger difference between the BBC, for example, which absolutely must not have an opinion. That's almost written in the charter, right? And The Economist, which, you know, people pay for the analysis of it because it has an opinion, and people, you know, either want to read it or more likely agree with it, right? And so in that sense, the guardrails are already there. And like, I know that I feel kind of this way, and it would be a fool's game to betray that. But I like to think that the Economist's way of doing things is, you know, a genuine battle of ideas rather than of ideologies, right? And that it doesn't, you know, it doesn't really, there aren't many crashes against the guardrails, if you like. But I also think that it's, you know, it's virtually impossible for people to remove all of their biases. And I think a lot of the story of the BBC and people who get slapped on the wrist for saying this or being too gleeful when saying that and so on is you're seeing how it's kind of impossible for someone to completely extract themselves from their ideas and imagine that there isn't an objective truth. Does that answer the question? I know it doesn't, but I think to properly answer it, it takes about 187 pages.
Yeah. So yeah, the question more, I mean, clear that he asked is, he asked also in picking the right scientific topics to showcase in a neutral way. But yeah, this would be more, it's more of a general, but maybe we'll stop here. I have a very short question to end. In the entire journey from journalism, from research to journalism, we always look for mentors, irrespective of what career stage. So, do you have any specific people or in mind that who were responsible for, who have always encouraged you? So, any mentors that you would like to mention?
This is my chance to give them a shout out at the end.
Yeah.
I mean, there are two that spring to mind. I mentioned earlier that one of the first places I got published was Materials Today, this trade mag. I had actually written in, they were doing a writing contest, I think. Again, revealing how much they're kind of hungry for new talent to fill their pages. And I did not win the contest. And like every time you fail at an interview or a contest, I did the sort of like seeking some feedback thing. And the lady who was the editor-in-chief at the time came back to me and said, it was a fine very nicely couched. It was a fine submission, but here's what you did wrong, and gave me quite a detailed rundown on where I had gone wrong with stuff. In so doing, teaching me some journalism basics, I think, and that started a relationship that I ended up writing for them on and off for 5, 6, 7 years, maybe only 5, but it was because she was willing to kind of take some time and tell me out of what was doubtless an extremely busy day to just say, this was good, but it would have been better if you had done this. Whereas most editors, myself included, most of the time, you get the copy in, you change it, you send it back. Is that okay? Not like, here's why I changed it, because it takes some effort. And she took a lot of effort over that time with me when I did not know what I was doing. And by the time she was done teaching me some things, I knew what I was doing a little bit. And for that, I will be forever grateful. And then when I was at the BBC, one of the science correspondents there had been around for a long time, got his start in local radio, and had worked up to being, broadcast, one of our big broadcast folks, and was the most amazingly knowledgeable and yet humble people, and just never hesitated to give advice, to give you encouragement, to tell you how to navigate what is ultimately an extremely complicated system. And basically in lots of instances, hand over his stories or his knowledge to people who, were then going to go promulgate it in the world. A lot of journalists are extremely protective of their sources, of the knowledge that they've gained, of the sort of their particular take on things. He was a completely open book, and I couldn't respect that more when somebody's just like, the important thing is that we get out to the audiences the best that we can, and if you're about to go on TV and talk about this thing, then here's what you need to know, without any ego, without any reservation, for that, he gets the shout out at the end.
Okay, on that note, thanks again, Jason, for accepting our invitation. But now that
it's a
we know
pleasure.
that you have done it this year, we are going to pursue you again for different forums and for more talks, maybe in person sometime.
Love to.
It was truly a delightful conversation. Nicoletta, you want to add anything at the end?
As well, a big thank you for your time and also for being an open book to us.
Honestly, it's been a pleasure.
Also, thanks to all the participants, because your questions really help. My questions, I exhausted half an hour before. So thanks a lot for asking all the probing questions. Have a nice evening. Bye.
Right. Thanks. Take care all.
Yeah.
Bye.